You know, some secrets are meant to stay buried, hidden from curious eyes and eager hearts. For years our town had one of those secrets. Lying in a shadowy grove where fog never lifts and even birds refuse to sing, Mill Creek Well had always seemed cursed. Stories whispered that it wasn't just an abandoned well, but a portal. A gateway to somewhere wrong. But back then, I didn't believe in such things. I wish I had, before it was too late, before the Hollow Ones crawled out of the dark. The story begins with our protagonist, a lifelong resident of Mill Creek, a town so isolated that nothing remarkable ever happened there, until last fall. There was no warning, no omen, no clue that life was about to take a nightmarish turn. The town's legacy as a safe, quiet place would soon be shattered. Our narrator was always the curious one, even as a child. They'd spent hours in the nearby woods, daring their friends to wander deeper, convinced there were hidden treasures, ancient secrets waiting to be found. But it was the old well, standing alone in the center of an overgrown clearing, that had always captured their attention the most. It was weathered and ancient, a relic from when the town was founded. No one talked about it much. In fact, people avoided even looking at it. As teenagers, they'd been drawn to it once, daring each other to peer inside. The stories told around town said it was haunted, a place where the lost would come calling. In those days, they'd laugh it off. But in the dead of night, when the fog settled thick over the ground, the old well held a menace they couldn't quite place. Now as adults, life had grown dull, even stifling. That's what pulled them back to the well last autumn, a gnawing sense of restlessness. Our narrator couldn't resist the old pull. On a cold, fog-drenched October night, they called up the friends who'd explored with them as kids. Tommy, Sarah, and Nate. They met at the edge of the woods with flashlights and beer, nostalgia in their voices and nerves running high. Their laughter faded as they entered the clearing. The well was as it had always been, dark, cold, and silent. A bitter chill clung to the air around it, though the night wasn't cold. Even the trees seemed to close in, like black silhouettes reaching out to smother the light. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. A pause, then silence. Just the faint rustling of leaves, or so they thought. But then, faint, echoing. Voices. A shiver crawled up their spines as they strained to hear. Voices, pleading, desperate, rose from the depths of the well. "Help us. Let us out." Tommy tried to laugh it off, but his voice shook. "Come on, it's just the wind." But even he didn't sound convinced. The others took a cautious step back. Our narrator, however, was entranced. That's when they felt the pull, an overwhelming compulsion to look inside, like something down there was calling to them. Against all reason, they leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. Their flashlight couldn't reach the bottom, but they swore they saw movement, a glint of something pale and sickly writhing in the shadows. And then, the hand. A bony, withered hand, barely visible, reaching up from the darkness below. They stumbled back, but it was too late. The fog thickened, turning almost tangible, twisting in the air like fingers reaching out from the earth. And then, they saw them. Crawling up the stones of the well, dozens of pale, emaciated figures, the Hollow Ones. Their bodies were misshapen, eyes black holes set in lifeless faces, hollow mouths open in silent screams. Someone shouted, but the sound was swallowed by the dense fog. They ran, stumbling and clawing through the woods, the laughter and heavy footsteps of the Hollow Ones echoing after them. But the Hollow Ones didn't leave the well. They stayed behind, for now. The narrator tried to return to normal life, but nothing was the same. The Hollow Ones haunted their sleep, whispered in their ear at night. Their friends, too, had changed. Sarah was the first to vanish. Her family woke up one morning to find her bed empty, her shoes at the front door. Tommy followed next, leaving his house late one night. By morning, he was gone. The last time our narrator saw Nate, he was sitting at the edge of the woods, staring blankly into the distance. Their friends weren't just missing. They were erased. Family and neighbors no longer remembered them, not even faintly. It was like they had never existed. One night, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, our narrator went back to the well. They wanted answers, or maybe they wanted to be rid of it once and for all. As they approached, the voices from the well greeted them with gleeful anticipation. "Welcome, back," they murmured. The narrator felt something cold wrap around their ankle, tugging them toward the well. Desperate, they pulled away, tripping over something on the ground. A small, glass vial filled with a viscous liquid, and a note that read, "Drink this if you dare face them." Without a second thought, they downed the liquid, feeling a numbness settle over them. They climbed down into the well, each step sinking them deeper into the cold, damp darkness. The walls closed in, the light from above fading until they were enveloped in total blackness. They stumbled into a large chamber at the bottom, a place even colder than the well itself. The air was thick with rot, and in the center was a pit filled with the hollow ones, faces warped, bodies writhing in agony. They saw their friends there, frozen and empty, now part of the hollow ones. The narrator's heart broke, knowing they'd come too late. The whispers filled the air, louder now, demanding a price. To free them, give us your memories. They recoiled. But then, they thought of their friends' hollow, lifeless faces. They couldn't leave them to this fate. They nodded, and as they spoke the words they knew by instinct, each memory unraveled, each shared laugh and moment of joy slipping away, pulled into the pit by unseen hands. Days passed in a numb haze. Their friends were gone from their mind, only faint shadows remained. The well was quiet, and the town went on as if nothing had happened. But every so often, when the fog rolls thick over Mill Creek, they hear it, a whisper calling from the depths. The hollow ones are still there, still waiting, hungry for more memories, more souls. And our narrator knows, someday, they'll come for them too. Some places hold secrets no one should uncover. In our small town of Mill Creek, everyone knew of the old well in the forest, though no one talked about it. For years, it was just a hushed part of our history, a shadowy relic of a time long past. But then, one foggy October night, we found out why. And by then, it was already too late. Because the souls beneath Mill Creek Well don't forgive, and they never forget. The story begins with our narrator, a lifelong resident of Mill Creek, a town so remote that many believed it to be haunted by nature itself. Tall trees surrounded the town like watchful guardians, casting shadows that stretched endlessly at night. The older generations always warned, don't go near the well after dark. That's when it calls. But for most, the well was a myth, a relic of children's bedtime stories. Nothing more. One of the narrator's childhood friends, Tommy, was the first to bring them to the well. On a dare, they snuck out one night and found it. Hidden deep in the woods, an ancient, moss-covered stone structure that looked like it had been abandoned for centuries. When they peered into its dark, endless mouth, it was as if the light itself couldn't reach the bottom. And as they stood there, they all heard something. A faint whisper, like the wind or a distant voice. After that night, the well stayed a mystery, always lingering in the back of their minds. They didn't dare to go near it again. Until years later, the friends, Tommy, Sarah, Nate, and our narrator, found themselves together once more, sharing drinks by a bonfire. The fog was thick that night, blanketing the town in eerie silence. It was then Tommy made a fateful suggestion. Let's go see the well. There was a nervous laugh, but no one truly objected. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe the lure of the unknown, but one by one, they agreed. Grabbing flashlights and pulling on jackets, they headed to the woods, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. As they drew closer, an unnatural silence swallowed the forest around them. Even the sounds of insects and distant animals ceased, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. When they reached the clearing, the well was just as they remembered. Ancient, silent, but somehow alive, as if it had been waiting for them. Cold air wafted up from its depths, carrying an indescribable stench that filled their lungs and left a metallic taste in their mouths. It was then they heard it. The unmistakable sound of voices, faint but clear, rising up from the darkness. Help, help us. The voices were filled with pain, a sense of desperation that froze them in place. Sarah gasped, taking a step back, her flashlight flickering. But the narrator was transfixed, unable to look away from the well's dark, yawning mouth. The voices grew louder, pleading, crying, filling the night with an unholy chorus. And then they saw something moving in the shadows below. Some places hold secrets no one should uncover. In our small town of Mill Creek, everyone knew of the old well in the forest, though no one talked about it. For years, it was just a hushed part of our history. a shadowy relic of a time long past. But then, one foggy October night, we found out why. And by then, it was already too late. Because the souls beneath Mill Creek Well don't forgive, and they never forget. The story begins with our narrator, a lifelong resident of Mill Creek, a town so remote that many believed it to be haunted by nature itself. Tall trees surrounded the town like watchful guardians, casting shadows that stretched endlessly at night. The older generations always warned, don't go near the well after dark. That's when it calls. But for most, the well was a myth, a relic of children's bedtime stories. Nothing more. One of the narrator's childhood friends, Tommy, was the first to bring them to the well. On a dare, they snuck out one night and found it. Hidden deep in the woods, an ancient, moss-covered stone structure that looked like it had been abandoned for centuries. When they peered into its dark, endless mouth, it was as if the light itself couldn't reach the bottom. And as they stood there, they all heard something. A faint whisper, like the wind or a distant voice. After that night, the well stayed a mystery, always lingering in the back of their minds. They didn't dare to go near it again. Until years later, the friends, Tommy, Sarah, Nate, and our narrator, found themselves together once more, sharing drinks by a bonfire. The fog was thick that night, blanketing the town in eerie silence. It was then Tommy made a fateful suggestion. Let's go see the well. There was a nervous laugh, but no one truly objected. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe the lure of the unknown, but one by one, they agreed. Grabbing flashlights and pulling on jackets, they headed to the woods, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. As they drew closer, an unnatural silence swallowed the forest around them. Even the sounds of insects and distant animals ceased, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. When they reached the clearing, the well was just as they remembered. Ancient, silent, but somehow alive, as if it had been waiting for them. Cold air wafted up from its depths, carrying an indescribable stench that filled their lungs and left a metallic taste in their mouths. It was then they heard it. The unmistakable sound of voices, faint but clear, rising up from the darkness. Help, help us. The voices were filled with pain, a sense of desperation that froze them in place. Sarah gasped, taking a step back, her flashlight flickering. But the narrator was transfixed, unable to look away from the well's dark, yawning mouth. The voices grew louder, pleading, crying, filling the night with an unholy chorus. And then they saw something moving in the shadows below. It started with pale, bony hands that clawed their way up the stones, followed by twisted faces, hollow-eyed and gaping. Slowly, figures began to emerge, dragging themselves up from the depths like creatures birthed from the earth itself. They were thin, almost skeletal, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes dark voids that reflected nothing. The friends took a step back, paralyzed with horror as the figures continued to rise, more and more of them, until dozens of pale, ghastly faces stared up at them from the edge of the well. Nate was the first to break, turning to run, but the hollow ones moved fast, dragging him back toward the well with inhuman strength. He screamed, struggling, but his voice faded as they pulled him down into the darkness. The others tried to flee, but as they stumbled through the forest, the fog thickened, swallowing their path and making it impossible to see. Our narrator ran, clutching Sarah's hand as they stumbled over roots and branches, their flashlights barely cutting through the dense mist. But everywhere they turned, the hollow ones were there, emerging from the fog with silent, grasping hands. They could feel their icy fingers brushing against their skin, their empty eyes staring into their souls. Every time they looked over their shoulders, they saw Nate's face, pale, hollow, and twisted, his eyes wide with a silent scream. After what felt like hours, they finally stumbled out of the woods and collapsed in their homes, locking the doors and barricading the windows. But sleep never came. The faces of their friends haunted their minds, and in the dead of night, they heard the whispers calling to them from the shadows. The next day, the town was eerily quiet. No one spoke of the well, and no one seemed to remember Nate at all. When our narrator asked people about him, they just stared, their faces blank, as if the memory of him had been erased from existence. The well's curse was stronger than they could have imagined. Days turned into weeks and the nightmares grew worse. Every night, our narrator would wake up to find cold handprints on their windows, the faint sound of whispers creeping through the darkness. And each night, the whispers grew louder, until they became an unending chant that echoed in their mind. Come to us. Join us. One by one, their friends disappeared. Sarah vanished in the dead of night, her car left abandoned at the edge of the woods. Tommy's house was found empty, his door wide open as if he'd been pulled out into the darkness. The town forgot them all, their names erased, their memories fading. Only our narrator remembered, haunted by visions of their friends' faces twisted in agony, reaching out to them in silent screams. Desperate, they returned to the well, hoping to end the curse. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around the clearing like a living thing, pulling them toward the edge. The voices echoed louder now, deafening, calling their name, begging them to join. With a shaking hand, they looked into the depths and whispered, "What do you want?" The hollow ones answered, their voices blending into a single guttural sound. "We want what was stolen. Memories, lives." The narrator knew then that they could never escape. They were bound to the well, cursed to remember what everyone else had forgotten. They would be the last to join, the final piece of the Hollow Ones collection. As they leaned over the edge, a pair of hands emerged, grabbing hold of them, dragging them down into the darkness. Weeks passed, and the town carried on. New families moved in, unaware of the shadows that haunted Mill Creek. The well became nothing more than a myth, a ghost story told by children who dared each other to look inside. But on foggy nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the voices echoing from the depths, pleading, crying, calling out for help. And if you're brave enough to lean over the edge, you might catch a glimpse of a face staring back at you. A face that was once just like yours. A chill ran through the group, but before anyone could pull away, they heard it. A voice so faint it barely seemed like a sound. A whisper. "Help us, please." Sarah stumbled back, but the rest of them remained transfixed. Slowly, more voices joined in, their tones filled with an unrelenting, soul-crushing despair. Then, something moved in the darkness. Hands, pale, bony hands began to reach up, clawing against the well's edge, as if trying to escape from below. The faces became clearer, and with each second, they drew closer to the surface. Nate, panic overtaking him, turned to run. But as he took his first step, the fog thickened, forming a barrier that seemed to close him in, trapping him. His flashlight flickered wildly, and the shadows around him seemed to grow longer, wrapping themselves around his ankles, pulling him back toward the well. He fought, shouting and clawing, but the hands grasped him with unnatural strength, dragging him closer to the edge. His screams were swallowed by the well as he was pulled down into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. The remaining friends tried to flee, but the forest seemed to warp around them. Branches twisted and stretched out, blocking their path, and the mist grew thicker, swallowing their cries for help. Sarah and Tommy clung to each other, but the whispers intensified, filling their heads with a cacophony of voices. They couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched from every angle, and shadows danced around them, forming fleeting, ghastly images of faces they didn't recognize. Some youthful, others grotesquely aged, all hollow-eyed and haunting. Desperation set in. The narrator grabbed Sarah's hand, but Tommy stumbled, falling behind. As they looked back, they saw him staring at something only he could see, his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering under his breath, saying, "They're here. They've always been here," before his flashlight died, leaving only the faint outline of his figure in the fog. The narrator and Sarah ran blindly, breathless, their legs heavy as if the forest itself was pulling them down. Finally, they broke through the trees, collapsing onto the pavement of the town's edge. They looked back, but the fog had already devoured the path, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. When they tried to tell others what had happened, no one believed them. And soon it was as if their friends had never existed at all. Townsfolk looked at them with pity, assuming they were overcome with grief. But deep down, the narrator knew the truth. The well had taken them, just as it had taken others before. Nights became unbearable. The narrator began hearing things, whispers echoing from darkened corners of their home, mirrors reflecting faces that weren't their own. Every time they closed their eyes, They saw the well, saw their friends' faces staring up at them, mouths open in silent pleas for mercy. Finally, in an attempt to end the torment, the narrator returned to the woods, now overgrown and eerily silent. The fog rose thickly around them, guiding them back to the cursed well. They peered over the edge, calling out to the voices that had haunted their dreams. "What do you want?" they whispered, their voice trembling. The voices responded, a singular guttural sound filling the air. "You, forever." The narrator felt something grasp their shoulders, icy and unrelenting, pulling them closer to the edge. As they struggled, a pale face emerged from the shadows, a familiar face, frozen in terror. It was Nate, his mouth open in a soundless scream. Beside him, more faces emerged, Sarah, Tommy, and dozens of others, all trapped in the well's darkness, their eyes wide, desperate. Before they knew it, they were falling, tumbling down into the endless darkness, surrounded by the faces of those who had vanished before them. The last thing they heard was the laughter. A sickening, hollow laughter, echoing from the depths as the well swallowed them whole. They say on misty nights, if you wander close to the edge of the forest, you can still hear them. Soft, pleading whispers trapped beneath the earth, calling out for someone, anyone, to save them. But if you're brave enough to lean over the edge, beware. You might just feel a hand on your shoulder, pulling you down to join the cursed souls beneath Mill Creek Well.